Do you know what a carbon footprint is and why it is important for your pineapple company? A carbon footprint is the amount of greenhouse gas emissions associated with the production and consumption processes of the pineapple sector. And it can be expressed as tons of carbon dioxide equivalent emitted, a universal unit for comparing emissions. As a consequence of climate change, companies in the pineapple sector are keen to implement measurements to understand and measure their own carbon footprint. The importance of this is supported by data from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. According to the latest IPCC report, human activities that generate greenhouse gas emissions are causing global warming. As a result, the global surface temperature has increased 1.1 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels between 2011 and 2020. Global greenhouse gas emissions continue to increase due to excessive use of fossil fuels, changes in land use, lifestyles, and unsustainable consumption and production patterns in regions and countries and by individuals around the globe. Why is it important to measure our carbon footprint? Well, determining the carbon footprint makes it possible to identify opportunities to reduce emissions and contribute to mitigating the effects of climate change. In addition, it is useful for making decisions regarding the efficient use of resources and operations linked to pineapple production and packaging. And more efficient use of resources, such as fuel or agrochemicals, may result in cost savings. To achieve these benefits, it is important that once the carbon footprint has been measured, the company establishes strategies, such as a plan to manage and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But how is the carbon footprint calculated? The carbon footprint is obtained by quantifying greenhouse gas emissions. To do so, an inventory of emissions is carried out prepared. Emissions represent the release of one or more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. Some of the most important are carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. The most common approach to calculate GHG emissions is through the application of emission factors, which relate consumption data such as fertilizer use or transportation, with the emission of gases and their global warming potential represented as carbon dioxide equivalents. So, what are the main steps to calculate our carbon footprint? 1. Define organizational boundaries. 2. Set report boundaries. 3. Collect activity data. And 4. Quantify emissions. Let's start with defining the organizational boundaries. This step involves defining the inventory, including the activities and facilities over which the company exercises control, and defining the areas that will be considered, such as packing facilities and growing areas. Next, establish the limits of the report analysis. This includes the identification of direct and indirect GHG emissions and removals associated with the company's operations. A source of GHG emissions refers to any activity or process that, when carried out, releases GHG emissions into the atmosphere. Direct GHG emissions means represent the emissions from that the activities or processes are owned or controlled by the company. For example, the fuel consumption of owned vehicles, the application of granular fertilizers in the crop, or the management of pineapple stubble. On the other hand, an indirect GHG emissions comes from operations and activities that are not owned or controlled by the company. For example, the consumption of electrical energy that is produced elsewhere, fuel consumption due to subcontracted transportation from the farm to the port, or the disposal of waste in a landfill. Once the emission sources are identified, activity data is collected. The activity data is the specific quantitative measure of the source that generates the emissions, and that will allow the emissions impact to be counted. Examples of activity data are liters of fuel consumed, amounts of nitrogen fertilizer applied, amounts of refrigerant recharged in cooling equipment, and electricity consumption, among others. When you have the activity data collected, you can quantify emissions by consolidating the emissions inventory in tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. Based on the consolidated inventory, your company can make technical and financial decisions can be made about reducing the emissions that are being produced in the company by your operations. How can you start calculating your company's carbon footprint? The Food and Agriculture Organization developed the Carbon and Water Footprint Measurement Guide for the pineapple value chain, a methodology for the pineapple sector to understand the main steps for quantifying their carbon footprint. The guide helps companies to establish the limits of the emissions inventory of their operations, quantify the emissions of their main activities, consolidate the results, and identify possible reduction initiatives. Now that you know more about the importance of calculating your carbon footprint in pineapple production, we invite you to explore our guide and calculate your company's carbon footprint.